The Producer Podcast is back, and we're stepping into the world of the guilds and unions of the film industry as I'm joined by Maggie Kraisamutr and M. Patch from VFX Iatse to talk about the work to get the VFX union established and how that will benefit the industry as a whole. So without further ado, let's get started. So before we get into talking specifically about the visual effects union that's trying to get going, maybe just introduce yourselves and kind of give listeners your background.
For me, yeah, I was working in client-side visual effects, as we call it, on-set visual effects on the production team for the better part of a decade. I started, as many do, as a PA and sort of worked my way up the coordinator, production manager, associate producer route. My last show was Nope, 2020. Yeah, I've been working with IATSE for the last few years, trying to bring union standards and benefits to visual effects crews because throughout all that time, I was working as part of the movie crew, but unfortunately, without the benefit of healthcare or overtime or all of the union standards and benefits that crew rely upon to, really make a life for themselves. That's kind of my story, Maggie.
So I've been a IATSE international rep here for a little over a year. And prior to that, I've been working as a visual effects compositor for 20 years. But I've been working in film and television longer than that, nearly 30 years. I've started my career in wardrobe and then studied animation and was working as an animator out of college. And then quickly transitioned over to visual effects due to the outsourcing and animation and the limited jobs that we were experiencing at that time. And so I've been doing visual effects since. Working primarily client side. I've worked at all the major studios as well as some vendor facilities, including some stereoscopic conversion houses. So my understanding and experience and history of visual effects is very in-depth, and also the movement of trying to organize. It's been a decades-long struggle for us, as we are one of the few crafts that's non-union in a largely unionized industry.
Wardrobe to animation to visual effects. That's quite the jump there.
Yeah.
So I guess one other question I had for both of you just before we get into the union side of things. But are there like any common misconceptions or maybe misunderstandings you see a lot of producers out there having about the visual effects realm?
I would say that like the literacy has gotten a lot better, right? And especially since sort of the streaming explosion and COVID and the ubiquitousness of a lot of the tools that we use and the processes for creating like final visual effects work. However, we still see the sort of persistent trends that always are going to be evergreen, right? Especially now with the volume, the deep fake and AI of it all. There's still sort of the sort of gap between the understanding of what the work is that we as workers and artists know, and the skill and time and just absolute dedication and experience that it requires to create a final level, feature quality piece of visual effects versus what, a lot of folks, sometimes even the folks signing the paychecks, understand. The truth is, right, that there's decades of experience, experimentation, and craft going into these processes. And all of the work that we're doing, the reason that we give up our nights and our weekends and our holidays to work on these shows and to get this work done, and into the DCP for people to project, is because we're dedicated to, yeah, this artistry and this level of expertise and care, that is the essential quality that makes visual effects work, right? It's not a button. It's never going to be a button. It's never going to be just okay, we need this and we can just, put in a program and spits it out. Like, without the dedicated technicians and artists who are experienced into translating a director's vision into a computer program that then will be able to let you create your artistic final product, then it's all, that's where the visual effects professionals come in, and why this union is so important, because ultimately, these are the people who are holding the knowledge, the experience, the ability to create this seamless work, because it does often just fool your eye and it looks so seamless. People are like, well, I expect this now from everything, right? But really, it's year and a half, 2 years of work from inception to delivery to get that to that level. And that's what we're really talking about, is the conditions that the people are working on during that time.
The work that we do is a craft, right? And we've spent a lot of years at school, or maybe, like in our off time, learning how to be an artist, and that includes studying, fine arts, studying the traditional arts, learning about lighting, learning about painting, sculpting, for 3D artists. While a lot of the work we do is with software, it takes years and maybe decades long of traditional training to even, be able to know how to use the software as a tool. And that's what it is. The software is just another tool that creative artists use to produce their work. And we're often treated as if we are machines, that we can output this work, automatically, like a cog in the machine, in a factory, just assembling these shots, right? And so it creates this environment where, we're dehumanized, and, we are human, and sometimes it is stressful. The workers are extremely dedicated to the work. They love what they do. They are loyal to the company, and they sacrifice themselves a lot to make deadlines, to do a good job, to prove that they are team players, right? And it's true that we don't get offered, like car service to go home after working 18, 20, 24 hours a day, there have been many times where I've come into the office and I see workers sleeping under their desks because they haven't left. They've just been working around the clock, not being paid for it because they're on a flat rate, right? And so, there's an expectation in Hollywood where, it's like we're on a schedule and we're on a deadline. But sometimes these deadlines, like, they get pushed earlier because the audience is demanding, they can't wait to see this movie. And that's happened to like a couple of productions that I've been on. And so, they think because of the advancements of technology that this can be done fast and quick. There's, consequences to that, and the consequences, people suffer for it because they're sacrificing their time, their energy, their time with family, and not just, sacrificing the time that they should be recovering, from a long day of work. And so that is what we're helping, to fight for, is to bring back the time back to the people, right? Because, are we living to work or are we working to live? But the thing is about artists is that we love the work that we do. And we sacrifice a lot of ourselves in our art. And sometimes people will take advantage of that, right? Because their goal is to meet a budget or their goal is to meet a schedule, right? Because it's their job.
That's all good things to remember. And I definitely have been in the position of working way too long for projects. So yeah, so looking then at kind of this move to get a union for the VFX artists, maybe start by just like, how did that get started and where is that process at currently?
The modern visual effects industry really began in 1977 or really 1976 with, ILM's founding by George Lucas for the Star Wars movie and the decision to really take those workers out of a traditional, movie making system. Obviously, visual effects is one of the original awards in the Oscars, right? It's been around like literally since the inception of Hollywood. I mean, look at King Kong. But this was done within a union system like the other crafts. But because of, the advances in technology and also the desire to sort of have this be a standalone entity of, a visual effects vendor company, which would be essentially subcontracted to do the work and deliver it for the movie. This began a whole new sort of, paradigm for the industry, which accelerated during the 1980s and 90s. And then obviously once you had Jurassic Park happening, everyone wanted visual effects in their films. And it's escal. I mean, I believe the figure is that like the first Jurassic Park movie had around like 80 visual effects shots, like, and we saw in Avengers Endgame, I believe, there was only 80 shots that were not visual effects shots, right? So like it's truly flipped. But throughout that time, we have really been working in the same exact environment, which is that we have been classified as, workers who are not party to the collective bargaining agreements that create this path to the middle class for the colleagues of ours working alongside of us on film sets that have really built Hollywood to be a sustainable home for filmmaking and artists. Um, that's the Hollywood system, but being on the outside of that, we have seen our workloads increase. We've seen deadlines shift and get smaller, and the level of feature quality work that was demanded get higher and higher. And I think especially during, COVID and the streaming explosion, all of a sudden everything going on streaming and television also was demanding feature quality work with sometimes half the schedule, so this really engendered a dire crisis for, visual effects professionals, many of whom were coming into the industry for the first time as these shows were staffing up and desperately needing VFX pros to come and deliver this work that was being demanded by the studio. At one point in 21, I believe, like there was something like two or three times more work out there being demanded than there were artists and technicians available to do it around the world, right? Like it was crazy. So we really felt that, not only is this something that's been going on for half a century, right? Like 50 years since Star Wars, but also is a crisis now that, if we don't do something about it now, when we are in demand, what is it going to look like in the future? So that really led to a groundswell of support from amongst the industry. And through a series of worker-led campaigns, we were able to unite and educate folks in visual effects about their rights under the National Labor Relations Act, which for workers and visual effects workers, the biggest misconception is, well, I'm not eligible. Or, hey, even if I am, they're gonna fire us all for unionizing or something, right? But the truth is that for us, we are private sector employees covered under the National Labor Relations Act, just like anyone else working in America. And we are able to, come together, like we said, with the help of Iatse being there with the educational, institutional support and the legal support. But mostly this is about workers talking to each other, right? Gaining the skills to educate themselves and then their coworkers about what it really takes to build up a level of support so that you can achieve a collective bargaining agreement. And so at this point, yeah, we have been able to do that successfully at Marvel Studios, Disney Studios, Apple, Lightstorm. I mean, we have more in Canada. Like this is truly an international movement too, like this is not just about us in America. But for those folks now, all have collective bargaining agreements now and is set up and covering those workers, providing them with access to motion picture industry health and insurance and pension plans, right? Which is, first of all, like immense, right? I mean, this was the situation where myself, Maggie, and many others can say, you might be on two or three different healthcare plans in the same year because you're bouncing from show to show and just whatever the studio might offer you as a kind of like stopgap solution or through the marketplace, paying for it yourself. In addition, overtime standards for, their work, job descriptions, safety provisions, minimum rates of pay so that people can't be just offered minimum wage or less for work, which is unfortunately something that we did see, throughout the industry, especially because a lot of these folks are being paid on flat rates, right? And so when you really break it down, the number of hours they're working, they're getting paid less than a living wage. Um, and so these are the kinds of things that we've achieved in our first collective bargaining agreements with these companies. The idea, right, is to be able to have all of the studios under a collective bargaining agreement, which is standardized for visual effects work. And that's the same system that our colleagues, such as camera, editorial, costume, all of the folks who work under the basic agreements or another IATSE collective bargaining agreement are able to rely on the fact that when they go onto a new show, and it's a union show, then they'll be getting their hours, they'll be getting their rate of pay, their safety provisions, and all of the things that we've achieved for them. Obviously, this has never been done before, right? Like this is like it's hard to, create a new union in a new space, but we do have the benefit of folks who have been working alongside of unionized employees for so long and have seen with their own eyes, like what a huge difference it makes to be able to get, rate like a living wage guaranteed to you with overtime, with healthcare provided for you and your family by the studios, right? Um, I mean, this is like life-changing stuff that we are able to provide for these people or that they're able to provide for themselves, right? Through the collective action. Um, so our job is really as educators, right? As coordinators to bring people together, but 100% of the work and success is due to these workers because they're the ones who are able to unite over their shared priorities for change. And their demands are so clear and so reasonable, right? Literally just asking for the same deal that the other folks alongside of them have been covered for, sometimes for over a century, right? And that's what the workers have been so good at doing. And we've seen this now through, multiple unanimous yes votes, right, to unionize, which is rare. You usually have some people who are like, I don't know, but this is like unanimous vote, unanimous votes. Everyone is like, yes, this, I can't think of a reason not to, so yeah, that's kind of like the inception of this kind of particular campaign in terms of like unionizing our visual effects workers and also, what we're trying to achieve with it, right? And what we've done, because our vision, for the future of the industry is visual effects workers coming together to advocate for themselves through collective action. Because as we've described, we are the ones that are able to create this flawless work again and again on time, and get it out for the audiences to enjoy. But in order to do that, we need to be able to live, we need to be able to have a sustainable careers and a life for ourselves and our families. And I think that that's the core of what our mission here is.
Now that's crazy. And yeah, getting ready for the episode, I was doing the math and realizing just how long visual effects have actually been around in the industry. And it doesn't necessarily seem like it's been that long, but it sure has.
It's crazy. I know, honestly, and we always, that's, when we started this and in previous attempts, there's the sort of thing that happened after Rhythm and Hues went down, right? And people were like really upset. There's the whole history there with Life of Pi winning the Oscar. However, the studio had closed a couple months before because they could not afford to keep their workers on. And all of these folks were protesting outside the Oscars, like, hey, what about us? But, so many times we've been told, hey, y'all are the new kids on the block, you're too fresh and new and dynamic. And, it was kind of this like Silicon Valley like mindset, which is like, well, you don't really need unions, right? Because we'll take care of you. Like, isn't it better to negotiate on your own? However, yeah, I think that we've seen not only with our colleagues, who are able to create work and lives for themselves, but also with, the real example now of the overwhelming demand for unionization and the successful bargaining agreements that we've already negotiated, and had ratified by these workers. That's not the vibe anymore, like we're very much here for what we deserve and we recognize our worth, It's really weird. Like, I'm not sure if I can think of another situation where your bosses, right, the director and the producer will be in a union or guild, right? However, you are not. I mean, it's kind of strange. So I think that that also, ultimately, obviously, like business is business, but anecdotally, there's a lot of support from folks who are, above the line for what we're doing. And, really it's like, hey, yeah, we've been waiting for this. It's about time. And at the end of the day, this is like better for, I mean, it's so much better for everyone. As someone who
Mhm.
was an associate producer, as someone who's, been in that world, uh, it's so much easier not to have to individually negotiate. It's the Wild West, and like having something that everyone is familiar with. Our collective bargaining agreements are based off of, pre-existing agreements such as Local 700 for the editors and Local 600 for camera, which have decades, almost a century sometimes, of negotiating put into them that have really done the work to address the needs of crew on set, in post, where we're all working. Um, so the fact that these companies are already familiar with working with those contracts, for decades, it makes it so it really makes sense for everyone,
It's important to also note that the contracts that we have currently are largely client side. And so I find it interesting, you were looking at, when you look at visual effects, they're generally divided between client side and vendor side. And so far, we've been successful at organizing client side. And why is that? There's a reason for that. It's because client side workers work next to and sometimes in the same room as union workers. I mentioned that I am pretty much exclusively a client side worker. I'm usually the only person in the room that's not in a union. And so, I'm sitting in a room with editors, directors, producers, writers. Actors come into the office, to do ADR sessions. The sound, people are union. And so I feel the difference in treatment and also in expectations and the demands of the work. It's really up to me to agree to these conditions or these terms, right? And so, and I don't have anyone to kind of back me up if there's a problem. It's pretty common for visual effects workers to have verbal agreements. Um, between, the producer or, their supervisor about their wages, or maybe what they're going to be getting paid if they were to work overtime, right? Or make, hours or stay longer. And, after the work has been done, because there's no hard, contract, no written agreement, to kind of fall back and reference, people go back on their promises, right? Or they say, oh, sorry, we couldn't get approval for this, even though you've done the work, right? And so it becomes like an afterthought, and there's nothing that the worker can do. With a union and a union contract, we can make it more transparent, right? Make it so that the communication is clear between the worker and the employee, and so that there's no misunderstanding or no way for people to just kind of take advantage of the situation, right? It helps everyone when things are, clear, and the expectations are clear. It makes for a better work environment. And so really, the union contract really does everything to support the person so that they can focus on perfecting their craft. And, and that the intention of that is to preserve the craft for future generations, because yes, filmmaking is a business, but it's also an art form, right? And it's worth preserving. And how do you preserve that? You have to protect the people who create it. You have to protect the talent. And, because I work alongside other crafts, um, I see what amazing artists they are, right? And it's just, and I want that too. I want those opportunities too, to grow as an artist, right? Because I see, everyone that I work with, they're all union, and I see how supported they are. And I see how focused they are on their craft and how dedicated they are about improving and learning and evolving, in their medium.
You both were kind of touching, I think, a little bit on this, but I'd love to dive a little bit more onto the AI topic, and just because that's the big concern across the whole industry, and just like how the VFX Iatse is going to kind of help guide and protect workers.
I mentioned my background in film, starting in wardrobe, then animation, and then visual effects. Um, the reason for that is because when I was studying animation, I was actually a stop motion animator, which requires you to build puppets and make little clothes. It's animation. And also a lot of the cleanup we do is in post, which is technically visual effects, right? So at the time when I was hoping to have a career as a stop motion animator, this was in the late 90s, actually. And then around that time, they introduced this new software called Maya. And there was this threat that that 3D was going to destroy the traditional animation industry, whether it's 2D or stop motion or even hand drawn. And so, yes, a lot of work shrunk, but a whole new industry was created, like a whole new kind of sector, in animation was created. And, as the years progress or the decades progress, a lot of people thought stop motion was a dying art form. Look at stop motion now. They are the ones that are winning all the Academy Awards for Best Animated Film. You have these stop motion studios that have been, doing work. And also that art form, it's a choice that directors are making. And so, my point is, Maya was a tool that artists used to tell their story. And I believe, for me, like AI is just a tool. right? That artists can use to help focus on telling their story without having to worry about like technical like stuff. And so I think because of that, the visual effects community has largely embraced AI. And I know it is controversial, in that a lot of people are feeling like, their departments are gonna, is gonna be wiped out or they're gonna be replaced. But it is the great unknown. There's a lot of things that, maybe AI shops are doing that we don't know about. There's a lot of secrets, trade secrets in our industry. But the reality is that AI, it might seem like it's a push of a button and then things are built like automatically, instantly, and perfect. It's not. There's actually a team of visual effects artists that you don't know about that's doing all the cleanup work, that might be adding their own like perfecting, touches. Um, that's something that's largely not talked about in visual effects, how much secrecy there is in the type of work that we do. And so the best thing we can do is to form our union, right? It is a subject of bargaining. If this is something that's important to the workers to talk about and to address the concerns and to create like some kind of protection and have some kind of say in the implementation of how we use this tool, create your union, get it in a union contract, negotiate for what you think is fair. And that is really the best thing we can do to arm ourselves from having AI take over, our lives and our jobs. Rather than sitting back and be passive and letting the, companies make these decisions on a whim without consulting with us, like, would you rather sit back and let someone else make those decisions and, dictate the course of how your career is gonna basically kind of collapse on itself? Like, are you gonna let someone do that, or are you gonna be proactive about having some kind of control, having some say, because you do have power. You do have a lot more leverage than you think. And I think that's our challenge as organizers, is to help empower people, by educating them about their rights and also about, their worth. Um, they are the ones who are creating the product that the company is selling to the audience, right? Studios are relying on people's talent to create the product. That's where your leverage is. It's in the work that you do. And so, I really hope that, when people listen to this podcast, that they recognize the power that they have. And with that power, come together, and create a union, form a collective voice so that you can make your voice heard. Because the company will listen, and they're willing to work with you. They want to work with you. And for us as workers, when we establish our union, it's not about sticking it to the man. It's because we're fighting because we want to continue to work with you, right? We're fighting for our jobs. We're fighting for longevity. We're fighting to be lifers at this company, because we love, what it is that we do.
And so that's the key, right? Is getting people to the bargaining table so that they can now, not in 10 years, not in 15 years, be able to say, okay, here's what my job is, here's what the roles of it are, here's where AI is acceptable to use, and here's where it's not, right? And for us, obviously, we've been working with tools like, rotoscoping and wire replacements like years ago were kind of turned over into this machine learning because it is more efficient. And so those are the kind of tools that we as workers want, right? To make our jobs more efficient, to make it less tedious, and let us focus on the artistry and the craft. Um, However, obviously, what we are against is either direct replacement, right? Which, we have not been observing, but we are wary of, and we want to get these protections in. But also the threat, right? Just the threat of, oh, well, it's pointless to try because, AI is coming down the pipe and blah, blah, blah. It's like the sort of standard line that, we hear, um, which is just ultimately at its core designed to make people feel less powerful and less able to come together in collective action to unite over their collective, priorities for change and ultimately get educated on the law, use the resources we have available, and put in actual real legal defenses into your work contracts, which is what we're talking about. That is like literally a concrete thing that we're able to do for workers right now and are doing for workers in our contracts that almost no other field that is threatened by AI has the power to do right now, which is huge. So for us, Iatse is at the forefront, and you can look up. They've been meeting with the Senate. They've been meeting with shareholders and doing the work nationally as well as within the Hollywood system. We're not obviously going to stand here and say like banning AI or something, like it's happening. It has been happening. But as we're saying, we have been using cutting edge technologies and tools in our work for decades. We're going to continue because our job at the end of the day is to create the best looking, most convincing, and most accurate representation of the director's vision that we can. And that's our duty to make sure that, we do have these workers there to create this work in the future. So for us, I think highlighting the fact that the threat of AI is sometimes more hazardous than the actual practice, because we do right now have laws in place at the National Labor Relations Act and others to protect workers from wholesale replacement, and we are able to coerce the companies into giving these deals and protections, but only if we have the courage and the confidence to come together with our coworkers to demand that.
There's a lot of good stuff in there that I was taking mental notes on. Um, so then my final question for you, if there are VFX workers out there who found this episode and are listening to it and want to learn more or get involved themselves, how can they get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, vfxunion.org is our sort of main hub. There's a contact form there which says you reach out to an organizer that goes right to our inbox. Um, we're constantly talking to people and trying to find, folks who are interested in this. Obviously, like so many want it, but there's the gap of education because in this country we don't do a great job about teaching people about their workers' rights and how to unionize. So that's really our job is to educate you because, this is ultimately has been and will continue to be a worker-led um, you know, grassroots campaign, which highlights the needs and priorities of you, the worker, and your colleagues, which is why, like, reach out to us. But ultimately, we're going to be reaching out to you and asking you to come together with your coworkers, and take that brave step of saying, like, hey, we're demanding this, but we need you, ultimately to contact us and say, hey, like I heard what you said, or I've been reading about it, and let's get in touch, let's talk. And then we can share these tools with you, we can educate you and teach you how to talk safely and securely and anonymously to your coworkers. And that's ultimately how we bring people together. That's the first step always. Hit us up at vfxunion.org, set up a time to talk to an organizer, and we will make a specific plan for you and your colleagues in your workplace because it's done through, real conversations with real people. And that's hard, and everyone is super, super busy and burned out and worried. But at the end of the day, we have experience now and have done this successfully and can do it for your studio too.
I also wanted to, just add to that, a lot of people think, oh, the union is Iatse. And we like to reframe that as no, Iatse is a labor organization that represents workers in negotiations to negotiate for a better contract. But the union is actually the workers. It's you guys who are the union. And you have to tell us your demands so we can fairly represent you in bargaining. And so I think that is like maybe the biggest misconception about a union, what a union is. A union is not a service that you buy into and they, help to resolve some of your issues. That's not what a union is. A union is what you put into it as a worker. It's your contribution, it's your voice that you're exercising. That's what a union is. It's a community of people who come together to support each other and to open their ears and hearts, up to hearing about their struggles and figuring out solutions on how we can, raise standards and protect ourselves. So that is something that I think is really important to frame around, like what a union is. It's the union is you. The union is us.
Yeah, I know I'm somebody that's definitely thought of the union the initial way there you described it instead of the other way around. On that, we're going to wrap up today's episode of the Producer Podcast. So thank you once again, Maggie and Em, for taking the time to come on today.
It was so great. Thank you, Micah.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And with that, we're going to render out this episode of the Producer Podcast. Join us next Friday as season 10 of the Producer Podcast continues as we move ever closer to our 100th episode. Until then, make sure to subscribe to the Producer Podcast, and thanks for listening.